From 100 ideas, you have helped us narrow it down to this one logo sketch. Now it's time to create the full visual identity. Logo sketches are great and all, but how do you actually go from that one sketch to creating a perfectly polished logo, different lockups, choose colors, and then turn all of this into a visual identity? Today we're going to focus on refining your idea, creating a finished word mark, an icon for social media, picking colors and fonts that fully represent the client, and finally implement all this on a website homepage. If you missed the last video where we created all these 100 sketches, Tulip Twig is an eco-hotel in the Scottish Highlands. We decided to go with this one really clean wordmark idea, where the U in the wordmark has a tulip from the name. We also have a really nice ampersand with a little bit more character that goes with the flow of the more cottagecore style of the brand. Let's jump into Adobe Illustrator and start actually creating this polished version of the wordmark based on our sketch. The first thing I want to do is find a font that we can use as the base for the wordmark. I want something that feels really timeless, but since we have this tulip that is quite minimalist, I don't think I want anything with serifs. I also think it would be quite good if the bottom of the U was quite wide, because that will help us create that tulip look. So just to try it out, I'm creating the Tulip and Twig only part and trying out a bunch of different fonts, and I'm using the pencil tool to roughly just draw out the tulip. Serifs definitely don't make sense, it feels too messy, but I really like this one called Renade, and because it's a variable font we can also play around with it to make sure we get that perfect feeling. We're gonna come back to the ampersand in a sec, but I'm gonna start working on the tulip now. I want to make sure I have the same thickness as the rest of the letters, and then we can use the pen tool to create one side and then mirror it to get a nice symmetry. Then I just want to look over the general spacing between all the different letters. For the ampersand, even though I do like this design, I actually created one that had a little bit more flow in it in one of the other sketches we looked at. So I want to revisit that one and see if maybe we can bring that one back. Since the rest of the wordmark is quite minimalist, I think this might bring that little bit of character and flair that we're looking for. This font has some variability, so to mimic that in the ampersand, I'm just going to use the pen tool to create a single line to start with, and then we can use the width tool to play around and make sure we get this right sense of thickness in different areas. Okay, so this is how the final wordmark turned out. I'm going to make a horizontal version as well, just so they have more flexibility in case they have a format where it's a very thin banner, for example, or any other spacing where you need that to be more of a horizontal layout. Next up, we need an icon that the client can use for social media icons, or maybe they have like a badge or a stamp that they want to use it for. So let's jump into that. I feel like there are two really clear paths here. The first one is to use the tulip, so that is a more distinguishable feature of the wordmark. And another option would be to take that ampersand and make that part of the icon because it has a lot more character than the other letter. For example, the T is quite simple in this design. I feel like in this case, going with the tulip is the best choice because the ampersand doesn't necessarily feel as unique as having the tulip because the tulip has connection to the name. So it's easier for that brand recognition kind of connection there. And sometimes you have a very unique ampersand. So for example, in this brand I created for Fox and Bear, we had a little paw in the actual ampersand, and that makes it unique enough that you can be recognized by just the ampersand. But otherwise I would probably try to put, for example, T ampersand T to have tulip and twig to try to create something there. But I think the tulip in this case is a better move because it's a little bit simpler. But how did I come to this conclusion, and how do you know what to use for an icon for your own word marks and your own branding? As a general rule, I think if the client has a very short name, for example, it's shorter than like 4 letters, using that one name can actually be a really good idea as like a word mark for the icon because you instantly have that recognition. There's not going to be any confusion about what the company is. You could even do it stacked where, for example, you have like Uniqlo do their logo, for example, where it's stacking the different letters in a way that becomes a little bit more of a round or a square shape. Readability is always going to be a massive thing here, so make sure that if you're doing this strategy, you're also using really high contrast between the letters and the background color. Make sure that you're zooming out, testing it in different situations, like for example in dark mode versus light mode, so that you really can know that this is going to work on small scales. If they have a longer name, then I would look for something recognizable in the actual word mark that you have. So this is what we've done here for Tulip and Twig with the tulip. But sometimes you might have ligatures that are quite distinct or something else. And even if you don't have that in, let's say, the first letter, you could actually use the first letter and then add a little bit of character that you have in the rest of the word mark to create a unique icon. And this is the same if you're creating, for example, a monogram where you have 2 or more letters that you're combining together. If you feel like the different letters aren't working as a good strategy, it doesn't feel like the right fit for the brand, you can of course create an icon. And this can be connected to the actual word mark, it can have a similar look, or it can be something completely different, where, for example, the word mark is very, very simple, and then you have an icon that is very distinct. We're going to be coming back to finishing the logo with some more lockups, for example, with the slogan or taglines and these different little additional details that make it a lot more flexible. But first we need to pick fonts that we can actually use for those slogans. We want to create that cozy, slightly old-fashioned, a little bit kind of British countryside, a little bit romantic feeling. So I'm looking for fonts that have that character. I'm thinking that serifs will be a really good option for the titles and also maybe for some quotes that we can pull out. If you're feeling a little bit unsure of what the different search terms mean and you want to be able to just write more of a prompt, Envato actually has an AI where you can write in a description of what you're looking for, like a romantic, classic serif typeface, for example, and then it will give you recommendations on those. For this project, because we want that kind of bookish, classic, more cottagecore feeling, I think revisiting the real classics could be a good idea for this. If you watch the channel The Future here over on YouTube, you might have seen that they have compiled a list of a lot of the very traditionally used, highly vetted fonts that a lot of designers go to. But we see fonts in the serif category like Bodoni, Baskerville, or Garamond, for example. I personally love Baskerville because I feel like it has a little bit less of that high fashion look that we see in some of the other ones, and a bit more of that traditional feeling. But before we actually make a final decision, I want to test out a bunch of different options just to make sure I'm on the right track. I actually really like the Mrs. Eve's one, and I'll tell you why. It feels a little bit easier to read than the Baskerville one, and it also feels very similar, but just a bit more friendly with this roundness that we have. I also really like the italics version, and I think that we could maybe intersperse some poems with the landscape pictures or taking time for yourself as a way to kind of bring that brand atmosphere. So I love that we have this italics option as well. So now we need a body copy to pair it with. One option is to use the same font in a smaller size and maybe in a lighter weight, but I think that there's something a bit romantic about it not being bold, this particular font, like you're inspired more by classic literature. So let's have a look for one to pair it with. I think my favorite is E.B. Garamond because it feels like you've just opened up one of those old books that you read and it feels like a really special story. These are different but still work well together. So this is our type selection for this project. So now we can head back to those different logos and create some really lovely lockups using the text as well. One little detail that I think will make this project even more special is to go back into those logo sketches that we made and look for some of them that we can actually repurpose as icons or illustrations. I'm thinking especially of the kind of more botanical or animal inspired ones. Let's have a play around and see what we come up with. How lovely did that turn out? So now we can sprinkle these into the design of the website and other assets as we start developing the visual identity more. So next up is picking the colors. Since this hotel is located up in the Highlands and you're really trying to escape that kind of city hustle and bustle, getting more quiet time for yourself and your hobbies, I really think that we should be inspired by the natural landscape and using colors that we could see there. Looking at the Scottish Highlands, we have a lot of light yellow and purple colors, as well as a lot of different tones of green that go a little bit more in the kind of grey, beigey tones, rather than very, very vibrant greens. I think these green tones will help us create a really nice calm base, and then we can use these pops of colors that we would see in the flowers as a way to bring in a little bit more energy and that kind of sweet vibe that we're after. I have this idea to play around with blending and kind of this watercolor effect or oil paint effect in Procreate so that we can actually bring a little bit more character and this brand stamp onto photography. So let's go look at some photography that we can then have a play around with. I want to make sure that I'm looking for photos that are both going to represent the actual hotel, so like what the rooms look like and what the landscape around it looks like, but also very, very inspired by the different feelings of things you would do. So like activities like reading or walking around in nature, maybe seeing some bees and lavender, for example. So that's where I'm going to be focusing my search. Because I'm going to try out this kind of smudging technique, I also want to look for pictures that already have a sense of maybe a little blurriness in the edges, or where I think that could be a really easy way to transform the pictures. So here are a few of the images that I think I want to have a little play around with. All I'm going to do is add them into Procreate, and then I'm going to actually use the smudge tool and set the smudging to oil paint. I'm going to lower the opacity and make my brush size really big, and then I'm just going to go over the areas where I want it to be smudged. So I'm going to pick an area like maybe a corner of the picture or maybe the bottom, so that I can eventually fade it out into white. And that way we can get this really nice watercolor effect that we can have as a really easy way to make the website, for example, feel super custom. I also want to create a little bit of a magical feeling, so I decided to also go in and add little illustrations on top after I've actually faded it out. So for example, with this beautiful image of the sunset in the evening, I've actually gone in and then added these little details to enhance these really kind of lush different plants. And I've added these little dots of lights that are playing around to give that magical feeling. This will be perfect for a section divider on the website or even the banner, for example. So we've made it. We have everything we need to actually create the website design. Well, except the copy. So normally I work with a copywriter because that's not my expertise. And so I would team up with someone because copy is kind of like the foundation of your website. You can have a beautiful design, but if the copy isn't compelling, your website just isn't going to work very well. But in this case, because this is a personal project, I have made up the copy myself, and we're going to be using that. The first thing you want to do is just add in all the copy and have a think about the best way to get the message across. I feel like it's so much more effective to create the layout based on the copy rather than trying to cram it into a design that isn't doing it any favors. Kind of like clothes, celebrating rather than trying to hide something. So now that we have a nice structure, I like to focus on where I want to add images, icons, graphics, and create a more natural reading flow. So for now, I'm just using placeholders, and then we can save time so that we can just finalize the layout first. I think the most important details that we want to communicate through this website is 1, what it is, so a hotel in the Highlands, 2, what different amenities are available, what the rooms look like, and what the availability are. And then also really importantly, who it's for, so that it's for someone who really wants to escape their day-to-day busy life, to spend time on their hobbies, reading, taking time for themselves, and enjoying good food. And I also want to make clear that there's a restaurant that you can access from your actual individual cottage. So to make that clear, I've started with a nice banner and even added a prompt to see available dates. This call to action is probably a little too early for most people, but if you've stayed here before and you want to come again, it should be really easy to book. I then created a section with a little carousel of images showing the rooms and a quick description of the general atmosphere. We then have a list of the amenities with little icons, followed by another call to action to book. If they scroll this far and they haven't clicked to book anything, I'm thinking they need a little bit of social proof. So here's where I'm going to be adding testimonials. I've also added an about section to bring a bit more personality. And finally, we have a last call to action to look at available dates, and just before the footer, their Instagram feed. I'm thinking that this is a brand that would be posting beautiful pictures of their food, of the landscape around it, of the cottage. So this would be a really beautiful asset to actually keep up to date. And they can even post things like different events that they're holding for different seasonal events, for example, and that could be a really great way to encourage people to go visit at a specific time of year. So to summarize everything we talked about today, creating a visual identity is a lot more about creating a specific feeling and curating different assets that are going to be transporting you into that atmosphere that we want to create, rather than ticking specific boxes about different assets. If you want to watch more videos like this where we create a full visual identity, I've made a playlist that I'm going to put here on the screen for you as well. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your projects and see you next time.